Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. We are continuing with our seminars. My name is Dr. Walter Veith, and we are going to talk about health and nutrition, which happens to be my field of research. I work at the University of the Western Cape, where we are pretty actively involved in this type of thing. I work largely with animals, food animals, and I simulate what is happening in the industry out there and try to determine what will be the effect on a consumer who consumes the animals that have gone through the raising process as it is currently done in the world out there. But this first lecture and the second one today are of a more general nature. The really hot issues come tomorrow. So don't miss tomorrow's lectures. They will be the humdingers. General things, life at its best, I've called this one. And we're just going to look at the primary nutrients in a very brief way, just to have a look how we should relate to them, what they are all about, what the world thinks about them, and what can we do to change perceptions in the minds of men. This is a very hot question today. Proteins. How much protein? You know, if you plan a dish, if you plan to prepare a meal, what is the dish that you think of? Have you ever seen anyone in the world invite someone over for potatoes and peas? Have you ever heard that? I don't think so. Very seldom. If you look at the general population of the world, it's, what are we having for dinner? Chicken. What are we having? Lamb. What are we having? Beef. Nobody says potatoes and peas and lettuce leaves and a carrot. Have you ever heard that? No. So in the minds of man, the protein is the numero uno, the number one. And the Greek for protein actually means to take first place. So for many, many eons, mankind has been schooled upon the idea that proteins are the most important component in our diet. Well, without proteins, you cannot live. Without proteins, you haven't got enzymes. Without proteins, you cannot build tissues. So proteins are incredibly important. But in the diet, do they take first place? Does that mean that the bulk of your diet should consist of protein? That is the question we really have to answer. Well, safe levels of protein intake as proposed by the FAO, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations University, three of them putting their credentials on these values, and uncorrected for nutritional value of the protein. And we'll see that in adults, we require, in a male and a female, the same amount of protein, only 0.75 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Now that is very small indeed. That means that the average woman needs between 40 and 55 grams of protein per day. And the average male between 50 and 65 grams of protein per day. You know, that is an incredibly small amount of protein. And yet, the average Westerner consumes many, many times that amount of protein. If you take a small child, you will see that even a young teenager in his growing years requires only 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. That is very, very small amount. So if he weighs 40 kilograms, that means he needs 40 grams. And a young baby will require 1.85 grams per kilogram per day, and we'll get all of that out of the mother's milk alone. So we can see that the protein issue is really a major problem in the world today. If you are pregnant, that means you have an individual, a new life growing in you. You only add 6 grams to the total. So let's say your body mass works out that you need 50 grams of protein per day. Then it would mean that you would need 56 grams of protein per day. If you are lactating, that means demand feeding an infant between in the first 6 months after birth. That means you add 17.5 grams per day. So if it's 50, that means 67.5 grams per day. Even there, 70 would be, wow, tops. And older than 6 months, it drops down to 13 grams again. Now, protein is one of those components that has to be assimilated and has to be used for whatever the body needs it for. So you need it for maintenance, you need it for enzyme formation, you need it if you are growing for growth. And you can see there that you really don't need enormous quantities. So let's take bodybuilding, for example. There was this question on bodybuilding. Do you think someone who is a bodybuilder will grow in muscles faster than a pregnant woman can extend this way? Yes or no? No. You wouldn't grow faster than a pregnant woman. So let's say your normal needs of protein are 0.75 grams per kilogram per day. What would you say would be the most that you would have to add to really be able to grow over time? Because you don't obviously pick up enormous quantities of muscle in a day. Well, do you think you need more than a lactating mother who is feeding a whole different individual who's growing like a, wow, like a mushroom? Do you think you need to add more than that? Probably not. But we see in the health business that people are using huge quantities of proteins. And anyway, in the normal diet, people are using much more protein than they actually require. What happens to the additional protein that we eat? When we eat protein, we digest it, and we convert it into amino acids. Is that correct? All right. Some of the protein, depending on the type of protein we are eating, can actually go through the intestines almost undigested and end up in the lower part of the intestine where bacteria will do their job. But the amino acids that we actually absorb, all those amino acids, we have to utilize them. And the body has what we call an amino acid pool from which it can draw over this 24, 18-hour period, more or less. So as long as you get all the amino acids that you require, the body can utilize these. Now, if you eat too much carbohydrate, then the body can store the additional carbohydrate as glycogen in the muscles, or if you eat too much fat, you can store it as adipose tissue, as fat. You know, the ladies can put it either up here or down there, and the men tend to carry it around here. So if you have too much carbohydrate or fat, the body has means of storing it. If you have too much protein, then what do? You cannot store it. There is no mechanism for storing protein as protein. So you actually have to convert the protein and change it into either the glycogen, which you can store in your muscles and in your liver, or into adipose tissue, into fat. And when you do that, because protein has a different structure to either fats or carbohydrates, then you have to split out the ammonia, the nitrogen in the protein, in the amino acid, because the carbohydrates and the fats that you are storing don't have nitrogen. And the body does that, and immediately, because the ammonia is highly toxic to cells, it converts it in human beings and in mammals generally to urea, which is also toxic, but less toxic than the ammonia and has to be eliminated by the kidneys. Other animals like birds and reptiles can convert it to uric acid, which is non-water soluble. They need that because they have eggs, and when they lay eggs, they can't have urea in those eggs. They need something that's non-water soluble. But we also can produce some of this, which can be a crystalline form, and if we don't have sufficient enzymes, can become a problem. So number one, if you have too much protein, you're going to have high levels of ammonia, and you're going to have high levels of urea. That brings me to the question of complete and incomplete proteins. Now you see, it's not just enough to have enough proteins, you have to have proteins that have the right amino acid sequences. And in the past, it has always said that animal products have a great amino acid mix. In fact, of all the recommended daily requirements that you have for the various amino acids, the amino acids in animal proteins supply adequate quantities of all the essential amino acids that we need. Whereas plant proteins are generally considered incomplete proteins, which means they don't have high enough levels in any one particular plant to supply all the amino acid needs that we have in terms of essential amino acids. But that, of course, only applies if you follow a restricted plant regime diet. If you have a variety of plants, you will get every amino acid that you need. So generally speaking, animal proteins are complete proteins, and plant proteins tend to be incomplete proteins. And that only refers to the essential amino acids, but not the non-essential amino acids. Let me just make one thing quite clear here. Essential amino acids are just as important as non-essential amino acids. The difference between the two is that the essential amino acids, we cannot produce them ourselves. So we cannot convert something else into those amino acids. We have to get them in the diet. So we have to get enough of all these amino acids in our diet in order to build the building blocks that we need for life. Non-essential amino acids are just as important, but it's not essential that we get them in the diet because we can convert other amino acids. We have the enzymes to produce these from other products. So essential amino acids are only essential in the sense that you have to get them in the diet because we cannot make them. And leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, that's a ring structure one, threonine, tryptophan, valine, and histidine in babies are generally considered the ones that we need. Now, if you look at the major food groups in the world, you will find that here are the essential amino acids, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, and all of those. And you look at animal proteins, you can see relatively high levels of them all. These are milligrams per gram up there. When you go to cereals, and you look at lysine, for example, and lysine is considered the limiting amino acid in the entire world. It is the one that they measure malnutrition on. You will find that animal protein will give you 84.3 milligrams per gram, whereas cereals generally only give you 30.5. So one could conjecture that cereals will not give you sufficient lysine, and therefore it would be better to consume animal products. But if you look at legumes, you will see that legumes have more than double the amount of lysine than you have in the cereals. So if you have legumes in the diet, plus you have cereals in the diet, there is no lysine shortage. And there's one other thing. If you have a diet that's high in animal protein, then that produces a relatively acid system in the digestive tract, and that hinders the absorption of lysine. So although the levels of lysine in this combination might be lower than when you had animal protein, you will actually be absorbing more lysine from this combination than you would ever get from an animal protein. So plant proteins actually can give you better lysine levels than animal proteins can give you. If we look at some comparisons, let's say seeds, which are generally complete proteins, you can see some really great comparisons here. Let's take steak, rump steak. And you look at tryptophan over there, it has 189 milligrams per 100 grams. And you look at, let's for fun, just for fun, take the pumpkin seed. 560, which one's higher? The pumpkin seed. Threonine 715, 933. Isoleucine 848, 1737. Leucine 1327, 2437. Lysine, that's the limiting one, 1415, 1411, about the same. Methionine 402, 577. Phenylalanine 666, bad number. Pumpkin seed 1749. Wow, that's 3 times as much. Valine 899, 1679. Arginine 1045, staggering, 4810. And let me tell you something, arginine is one of the most important amino acids. Arginine is the one that leads to your detoxification system. Arginine is the one that is used as a basis for creating urea, which is the toxic component that your body produces when it detoxifies ammonia. So it is one of those amino acids that you really need in high levels. And plant proteins generally, if you look at the list all the way through the nuts and through the seeds, give you much better arginine levels than any animal protein could ever give you. And histidine is important for little children. So on every single score, the plant protein was actually the winner. Am I right? Okay. So there's no such thing as to say that all plant proteins are incomplete proteins. Some of them are complete proteins and very good proteins. But of course, you don't live off pumpkin seeds, do you? So there is a point. You have to make sure that you have right combinations in all of this. So basically, when we ask the simple question, what is better, plant proteins or animal proteins, we cannot just look at the number of amino acids and the quantity of the amino acids that is present. We have to look at much more. We have to look at absorbability, digestibility, and the ratio of amino acids that you actually get into your system at the end of the day. Because yes, maybe there will be a large quantity of a particular amino acid, but that high quantity of that particular amino acid might be detrimental to your health. And vice versa. You might have a high quantity of a particular amino acid that you need lots of, and you don't get sufficient of it when you have one or the other. And I would like to present evidence for you today that it seems more and more probable that plant proteins are the way to go. Plant proteins are branched-chained amino acid profiles. They are much more readily digestible than animal proteins. For example, to digest a plant protein requires an acid medium in the stomach that never has to be lower than 4.5. That means you would never have to purchase an antacid. Have you ever seen an animal in the world that runs around with a bottle of antacids? As soon as you put an animal protein into your system, the pH drops because the enzyme's optimum has to be reached in order to even digest that protein. And so egg protein, for example, needs a pH of 1.5. Wow, that's pretty acid. No wonder people suffer from heartburn and indigestion. So plant proteins generally are much more readily digestible, and they give totally different amino acid profiles to animal proteins. Now, amino acids don't only contain this group called nitrogen over there that fats and carbohydrates don't have, but they also contain other components like sulfur. Like cysteine over here is a sulfur-containing amino acid, and methionine over there is a sulfur-containing amino acid. And when you break this down and you want to store energy in the form of fat or carbohydrate because you cannot store it in the form of a protein, then you have to split that sulfur out, and it always gets split out because it is a hydration reaction. It gets split out as SO4 minus minus, as sulfate. That's sulfuric acid. So when you have to digest these amino acids, you are producing in your system sulfuric acid. That tends to make the body go acid, and there's only one way to buffer that. The body buffers that by withdrawing calcium from the bone and putting it into the blood. Does that make sense to you? Now, unfortunately, to get rid of the sulfate, the only way you can get rid of it is by excreting it in your urine. And because it has the formula SO4 minus minus, in order to maintain the equilibrium, it always takes another ion with it that has a plus or a double plus. Now, because you are buffering with calcium, which is Ca++, guess which one it takes out with it? It takes the calcium out. In other words, diets that are rich in sulfur-containing amino acids are what we call calciuretic diets. You lose calcium out of the system. You urinate it out. But not only that, because of the acidity that it requires to digest them, you don't absorb as much calcium either as you would in the beginning. And then another few pointers. Some amino acids have ring structures like this one here, tryptophan and proline, which you also don't find in the fats and the carbohydrates. And these also have to be split out, and they're split out as phenols and treonins and things like that, which are basically carcinogenic in some cases or tend to be harmful products that have to be eliminated in the urine. Or they accumulate in the colon, where bacteria also break down some of these proteins and can cause problems over there. So a high-protein diet has a number of serious hazards. Let me just summarize this for you. Plant proteins contain more branched-chain amino acids than do animal proteins. And they are easier to digest than animal proteins. Everybody understand why? If you're branched-chain, then the enzyme, the pepsin that digests it, can cut it up more readily because it can get in. It doesn't have to have the high acidity to unwind the proteins. Then animal proteins are rich in sulfur-containing amino acids cysteine and methionine and have a greater proportion of aromatic amino acids phenylalanine and tyrosine, so they create more of these ring structures. And excesses of these two groups of amino acids have been associated with very, very degenerative diseases. Let me give you another important component. Plant proteins produce higher levels of arginine. Could you see the pumpkin seed was more than 4 times as much as the animal protein? You remember that? And all those in between had much higher levels of arginine than the others. Plant proteins also give higher levels of glycine in the blood than do animal proteins, and the higher levels of these two amino acids are associated with protection against the clogging of arteries and arteriosclerosis. That comes from various scientific groups, Nutrition Report International, you name it. This comes only from the scientific literature, from peer-reviewed journals. So plant proteins give you an amino acid mix which protects against disease. Another important factor is the ratio of certain amino acids, like lysine. Remember, that was the limiting one. and arginine, where you get lots of in the plant protein. That could be an important factor in determining the ability of a protein to induce arteriosclerosis. And that comes from review of clinical studies on cholesterol lowering response, Journal of the American Dietetic Association. So we have lots of evidence today that we cannot say a protein is a protein is a protein. When I started out doing research on proteins, and I have a lot of graduate students working on nothing other than protein, protein, and protein, I would not receive funding from the government agents because they said they don't understand what I'm doing. They say a protein is a protein is a protein. You digest it and you have amino acids and that's it. Then I write back to them and I say, no, that's not it. When you digest the plant protein, you get this profile. When you digest an animal protein, you get another profile. And that protein profile is good, and this protein profile is bad. Then they write back and say, it makes no sense to us, no funding. So then we started our research ourselves, and I used departmental funding to do it. As the professor, you can do those things. Just did it. Just used the funding and got the students through, and wow, then there was great excitement. But it took a lot of excitement before they finally started funding this research. And today, I'm a very highly funded scientist, and they love it. They love it, and they love the controversy, and they're just giving me money. I even get money from the Royal Society London for this research, which is very strange for a South African. Phenols have been implicated as promoters of bowel cancer. Ammonia increases cell proliferation, also has been linked to colon cancer. This comes from Bingham, 1996, Epidemiology and Mechanics Relating to Diet to the Risk of Colorectal Cancer, Nutrition Research Review, Volume 9, page 197. So there's a lot of information coming out. The Dunn Nutrition Center in the UK also does a lot of research on this, and it really is great to see that more and more we are beginning to realize that you can't just say a protein is a protein is a protein. So to summarize it for you really simply, I would say arginine and glycine need to be high in your diet, and you'll get that from a combination of plant proteins. You will never get it from animal proteins unless you eat a lot of animal proteins, which has another problem. And there should be enough lysine, which is the limiting one. But if you have combination, grain, legume, you should never have a problem. In Africa, sometimes when the nations get very poor, they only have maize, just one grain, and they have a gruel of maize every day, and that's their diet. That's a very poor diet because it has very low levels of lysine, and then maize in itself is one that is very highly water retentive, so they tend to suffer from malnutrition. But African nations that have grain-legume combination are the healthiest people on the planet. All right, so we did some experiments just to see if this was so. And what we did, we fed equivalent amounts of protein, exactly the same amount. So we gave these animals, rabbits in this case, an 18% protein ration. So they got everything else that a rabbit gets, you know, carrots, chomp, 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 apples, lettuce, leaves, you name it, everything a rabbit likes. But the protein source in the pellet was derived from soya protein versus milk solids as a protein source. And then the same amount of protein in both groups, and then we determined what was the level of arginine. And how do we want arginine, do you remember? High. And we fed these animals, and lo and behold, you can see that as time progressed, the group that received soya immediately was a lot better off than the group that received the milk solids. And it stayed that way. There was a little compensation on the milk over time, but arginine levels were always higher, significantly higher than in the other group. Plasma arginine levels of rabbits, and now we compared soya and casein. So we didn't take milk solids now. Maybe the fat has an influence on absorption. So we just took the straight protein, the protein isolate from soya. We didn't take the milk solids. We just took the protein casein, which is the protein in milk, And we compared that, and what do you see? Soya gave high arginine profiles, and casein, which is supposedly one of those supersonic, high-profile proteins, complete proteins, gave a much lower profile. Glycine, remember what glycine had to be? High. So we looked at glycine. And here we again have soya and milk solids. And look at that. Glycine was just about 3 times as high as you would get it with milk as a protein source. And the same happened with the other. And here are a lot of publications which tell us that rabbits that are fed animal protein develop arteriosclerosis and have elevated cholesterol levels even if their diet is cholesterol-free. Wow. If they are fed plant proteins such as soya, these effects are not observed, and the plant protein source was shown to decrease the degree of sclerosis even in those animals that were fed cholesterol. Now, that's not from me, that's from the literature. So we were interested in this. Why is it that animals that were not receiving cholesterol at all, no fat in the diet that contained cholesterol, why is it that if you give them one type of protein, cholesterol levels rise, and if you give them another type of proteins, they don't do that? Why does one group get arteriosclerosis and the other one doesn't? You see, the type of amino acid that you have in the end determines which proteins are going to be built. And cholesterol is carried in the blood by 2 groups of protein. The one is a high-density protein, the other one is a low-density protein. And we call it LDL and HDL. HDL is high-density lipoprotein, and the other one is called low-density lipoprotein. It's a smaller molecule and tends to go into the blood vessels, whereas the other one tends to stay outside in the blood. And so if there is cholesterol around, that protein will grab it and put it into the blood and take it out of the vessels where it causes the damage itself. So the type of protein determines whether you have good or bad cholesterol, and not really the quantity of cholesterol that you eat. Protein becomes far more important in terms of your overall health, and the control of protein levels is far more important than we ever realized. Animal proteins increase cholesterol levels. That is the bottom line. The protein alone increases the cholesterol levels, whereas plant proteins tend to reduce the levels of cholesterol in animals and humans. Do you know that just feeding someone who has high cholesterol levels beans, simple beans, baked beans, is probably one of the best ways of reducing cholesterol levels? And that is one of the amazing things that we're coming around to finding out. It is therefore not surprising that various national bodies and expert groups recommend an increase in the consumption of plant foods to improve long-term health. And then you can check it out in the literature. It comes from American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and many, many other sources. There are lots and lots of references. So we looked at rabbits, and we had a look at the cholesterol levels of the rabbits that were fed 18% protein, and we compared soya and milk solids. Remember that the milk solids have a fat component, am I right? And true, cholesterol levels, overall cholesterol levels, were much lower in the group receiving the soya than in the group receiving the milk solids. Now the question arises, is this increase in cholesterol as a result of the cholesterol that we find in the milk solids, or is it as a result of the protein? How do you test that? Well, you take away the milk solid and you just take the protein. You just take the casein minus the cholesterol. And what do we find? The same ratio. Can you see that? So what is it that elevated the cholesterol level? Was it the cholesterol and the fat in the milk, or was it the type of protein? It was the type of protein. And when we start understanding this, we can see that the type of protein that we consume can have a great impact on our cardiovascular system. Now, let's just talk about this issue, proteins and calcium. This was one of the great issues where we wanted to do research, which costs a lot of money. It's one thing about research. It costs a fortune. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of rands just to run one project of this nature. We were very interested in the protein-calcium connection. Remember the theory that I told you? If you feed something an animal protein, then it would have higher sulfur-containing amino acid levels. It would have to split that sulfur out as sulfate, and that would result in a loss of calcium. Firstly, to buffer, and secondly, when you excrete the sulfate. Am I right? Okay. By the way, pets, when you feed them animal protein, and you feed them the food, the cat food, and the this and the that, it has a very high level of animal protein in it, because the world is geared to the notion, well, that's a carnivore, therefore it needs a lot of meat. And therefore they give it the high animal protein, and their kidneys pack up. So most cats die from kidney failure. In nature, the animal also eats animal protein, but it is an opportunist. It eats then, and then sometimes for a few days not, and then eats again. But a pet gets fed protein levels at a level that it never ever really requires, and that is why our pets are diseased and dying of kidney failure. And even the veterinary associations of the world are saying, don't feed your cats milk, and don't feed them so much of this protein-rich food. They're beginning to understand, but they still don't know exactly why. Proteins and calcium. If you double your protein intake, you will cause a 50% rise in calcium excretion. 142 grams of protein per day will put anybody into negative calcium balance, whether that is plant protein or animal protein. And soy protein maintains calcium much better than any animal protein. So let's have a look over here at the incidence of hip fractures in women as opposed to per capita protein consumption in the world, milligrams per day. You will see that the nations that have a low protein diet don't have hip fractures. And those that have a high protein diet, United States, New Zealand. New Zealand is the biggest meat-eating country in the world, paralleled only by United States and white South Africans. And they're all up here and have the highest incidence of hip fracture. How much calcium supplementation does the United States take? Till it comes out of their ears. And they have lifted up the daily recommendations for calcium to 800 international units. I mean, really very high compared to what the rest of the world is taking, milligrams. Dietary protein increases the production of acid, as we said, which can be neutralized by calcium mobilization from the skeleton. So it's not just me saying this, comes from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 1995, volume 61. And we decided we want to check this thing out. So osteoporosis is caused by a number of things, one of the most important things being too much dietary protein. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Journal of Nutrition, the journal Science, everybody has this basic understanding of the issue. And in spite of it, they still won't fund you when you tell them you want to really check out why. Incredible. Well, so let's just go through this. You increase your protein consumption. You will increase your calcium loss because of the buffering process. That'll put you into negative calcium balance. That can affect your bone mass, and that can lead to fractures or deformities. Am I right? That's the theory. Now, in the industry, in the animal husbandry industry, animals are fed incredibly high protein rations. One of the reasons for this is when you feed an animal high protein rations, you are forcing it to convert that protein into fat or carbohydrate, and you are forcing it to store it, so it leads to fairly rapid growth. And so the industry feeds very high levels of protein. Now, when you feed, let's say, sheep, high levels of animal protein, because sheep get fed in the industry today, not grasses and shrubs like in the old days, it takes too long for them to grow. They get fed fish meal, carcass meal, blood meal, all those components. Carcass meal is everything that has been rejected at the abattoir as diseased. It is ground up, dried, pelleted together with grains and other things and fed back to the animals. It's one of the reasons why we have mad cow's disease, because you perpetuate disease that way. But you know what? In many, many countries, they will even have trucks going around picking up animals that have been run over on the road, dead rotten dogs and dead rotten cats and this and that and the other, and all of that goes into carcass meal. So it makes for a nice palatable morsel for whoever has to consume it. Well, there was a problem in the industry with sheep that were getting skew leg syndrome. Their legs were buckling. Now, that doesn't really matter if you're going to slaughter the sheep and eat him in the form of a chop, because nobody's going to see that a chop was skew in the beginning. But when you have a stud ram that costs thousands and thousands of bucks, well, if he comes out looking like a cowboy, that's a major problem in terms of the amount of money that he will raise. Does that make sense? So the industry was very concerned, and I was giving a lecture, and I claimed that the reason why they are getting skew legs is because you are feeding them too much protein, and particularly animal protein. Of course, they didn't believe me, but one of the scientists in the agricultural group came to me afterwards and said, are you really convinced that what you are saying is right? And I said, yeah, I'm convinced. He said, well, can we do an experiment on this? Can we run a graduate student through a program? I said, sure, I've got one, right, ready, let's move. So we did it, but he didn't want to test plant protein versus animal protein. He just wanted to test high protein versus low protein. And I nagged and nagged and nagged until we got it that we even tested plant protein versus animal protein. They couldn't understand my reasoning. You know, it didn't make any sense to them. Protein is a protein. So I explained and explained and explained, but eventually they knuckled under. So we took 50 mutton merino grams, about 100 days old, 12 days old and weighing 100 plus minus 12 days. So they were just over 3 months. They were just weaned and weighing about 28 kilograms. So they were still nice and small. And we divided them into 5 groups. And the first group got a 12% protein diet, basic diet, all derived from plant protein. And that's exactly what a sheep would get if he just grazed outside in the field. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so that's basically what he would get if he could get a little bit of lucerne to boost his diet and basic plant diet. Then we did what the industry did. We took the basic diet and we added 3% animal protein. So a 15% protein ration, of which 3% was animal protein. And we took the same basic diet and added 5%, that brought it to 17%. And then we took the same basic diet and we added 8% animal protein, and that brought it to 20%. Now, if you think, because we've been criticized over this experiment like you cannot believe, because the animals look pretty ghastly when we're finished with this thing. But the industry goes up to 35%. Okay? So we were being very nice to these animals. And by the way, I believe in animal rights, and I believe it's not right to confine animals to cages and to torture them and to do whatever we like with them. But in this particular case, what I do is all I ask them is whether I can climb on their bus and ride with them a little while, feeding them, their animals, what they would feed them anyway. And then taking some of them and feeding them something that I think is better. Do you understand what I'm doing? So I don't think I am initiating something that is against animal rights. Indeed, I am working towards proving to them that what they are doing is unethical. So it's actually favoring animal rights. So I get to be quite controversial on this issue. And then to have this double test, we took the same basic 12% protein diet, all plant, and we added also 8% plant protein in the form of grain gluten. We added that, and so we had a 20% total protein, all plant-based. You all understand what we did? Okay. At the end of this period of 6 months growth, so the animals were then 9 months old, that's what they should be when they are market size. The 12% plant-based diet had, this is limb skewness, had very nice straight legs. Then skewness in some increased when you added 3%. It increased more when you added 5%, and it really shot up when you added 8% animal protein. The plant protein one, 8% added, is not here. We'll compare it just now. So that is just starting with 12% plant and adding animal protein. Up goes the skewness. Now let's have a look at what that looks like. Now there's a Mr. Legs. Perfect. Straight legs, nice profile. He would do well on the plank. And there the legs start getting a little bit deformed. And this particular one was the 8% added plant animal protein. You can see that the foot structure here is very distorted. The leg is incredibly bent. This particular animal could not walk by itself. My colleague over here is lifting it up. And when it did walk, it walked on the calcaneus, which is down here. It looks like it's elbow, but it's not really, because of course they have an extended finger. So really, it is disastrous. In the field, the animal probably would not have gone that bad, but in a shed situation where it doesn't get exercise, which is what the industry does, that is what happened to the animal. So once it's shorn, you can see tremendous deformities in the legs. And we had, of course, 10 per group, and most of them, this one was the worst one, but most of them in the animal group tended to be like this. One other thing, just for interest's sake. The group that received the plant protein, and these were all rams, when you went in to work with them, they allowed you to work with them. You know, you draw blood, and you take urine samples. How do you do that? Well, you tie a little bag down and you say, please do it. That's what you do. Normally, they do it anyway because they're nervous and afraid, so you don't have a problem with a urine sample. The fecal sample is a problem because you can't pick up the fecal sample from the floor because they could have urinated on it and then you'll have a contamination. So you have to put on a glove and say, excuse me, Mr. Ram, do you mind if I take a sample from the source? And you take it out the back there, and that's what you analyze, you see. Now the problem is that when we climbed into the group that had a basic plant diet, that was okay. We could quite readily work with it with two. They would look at you like this and feel kind of like a sheep, a bit dumb, just standing there allowing it to happen. The more animal protein they had received, guess what? The more aggressive they were. When you climbed into that 20% plant protein group where of 8% was animal protein, I'll tell you, you had to be very, very careful, particularly as a male, or you come out of there singing soprano. They used to lower their horns. They used to go from, we had to climb in and hold on to them for dear life. What we wanted to see, what do we see in the x-rays? There is no osteopenic bone. There's no sign of anything really strange going on, but the legs were skew. So they were weak, right? There is the group in comparison, the samples of what we determined as very skew, straight, and intermediary. And then we had a look at something very interesting. We analyzed the bone of these animals because obviously they were in this industry, so they were going to be used for the industry, and I'm afraid they did end up as chops on somebody's table in the end after all. But we did have samples to analyze. We analyzed the bone calcium to phosphorus ratio and found something very fascinating. As you increase the animal protein, so the ratio calcium to phosphorus in the bone got less. Very interesting. Now let's have a look at those two top groups. Remember the 20% and the 20%, of which the one had 8% animal protein added, and the other group had 8% plant protein added. You remember that? Now this caused a major stir in the scientific circles of the world. We delivered this at the International Nutrition Conferences in Adelaide in Australia and in osteoporosis international meetings, and we tried to publish it. Do you think these guys wanted to publish it? Well, finally we snuck it in there. I don't think they really saw it. It is published, but you really have to look for it. Calcium loss. Total calcium loss in the urine and in the stool. Both of them got the same amount of protein. Both of them got exactly the same diet. The only difference was the protein source. If they received animal protein, they lost more than double the amount of calcium to the group that was on the plant protein. Isn't that interesting? Wow. And then you come to bone mineral density. That's the cannon bone, the one that we measured. Bone mineral density, and here I nearly fell off my chair. Animal protein produced a higher bone mineral density than plant protein. What do they test women for when they go for osteoporosis checks? They check for bone mineral density. And if it is high, what do they say? You're all right, off you go. Bone mineral density is good. Okay, what about deformity? The group receiving the animal protein had a much higher level of deformity than the group receiving the plant protein. Question: is bone mineral density a good measure of bone strength? Obviously not, because these had the skew legs, but they had the higher density. What is more dense, lead or steel? Lead is much more dense than steel. Which one's stronger? Steel. So is density a measure of strength here necessarily, yes or no? No. So when we looked at the ratio calcium to phosphorus in the bone, we saw that the group receiving the animal protein had less calcium relative to phosphorus than the group receiving the plant protein. In other words, there was a lot more calcium in the bone if they received plant protein than when they received animal protein, which means that the phosphorus is the one that actually causes the density, but the calcium microstructure is the one that causes the bone strength. Does that make sense to you? All right. Now this is very significant because later when we come to arguments about dairy and milk increases bone density, therefore it is good for you, you've got something wrong in your physiology, and only now are we beginning to realize it. It's not a good measure of bone strength. So we went to the Osteoporosis Foundation in South Africa, and by the way, the chairman of that foundation is the chairman of the World Council. So this is a very high-powered group. Got him very excited, very interested, and he did all the histological profiles on that bone, and he freaked. Look at this. Well, this one here gives you the best idea. This is what we call tetracycline double labeling. It labels the bone. So you give the animal a tetracycline injection, which is an antibiotic that stains the bone, and then you allow 10 days, you give another injection, and then when you cut the bone and put it under fluorescent light, you can see 10 days growth, and it gives you the best picture. Look at this. This is bone actual formation. How much bone, real bone formation is there? When they were on the plant protein, 12%, they had excellent bone formation. Can you see that? When you added 3% protein of animal, it became worse. Added 5%, it was still worse. Added 8%, it was still worse. Added 8% plant protein, it made no difference. So what is better, animal protein or plant protein? Plant protein. If you want to avoid osteoporosis, then avoid animal protein. Bottom line. Bone mineral density, trabecular bone volume, these are parameters which basically say the same thing on a histological level. Okay, then where do I get my calcium from if I don't get it from animal sources? What do they say is the best source of calcium? Dairy. If you don't have dairy, your legs are going to fall off and you're going to be a jellyfish. Have you heard that? Well, where do I get my calcium from? No doubt, dairy has a lot of calcium in it. Yogurt, 415 milligrams per cup. But greens have 400. Low-fat milk, 300. Greens, 250. And grains down to about 100. So about a quarter of what some dairy products will give. So obviously, people will say dairy products are great for calcium. But what good is all that calcium if, number one, you don't absorb it, and number two, when you do absorb it, you urinate it out? What good is it then? By the way, the fractional absorption of calcium from grains like bread is much higher than from milk. So although it only contains a quarter, it actually gives you a better profile. Gambian African women who never take milk and only have 300 milligrams of calcium per day, as opposed to US women when they are pregnant around about 800, almost 3 times as much. At the end of the pregnancy, the American women are in very poor shape and the Gambian women have perfect legs. Explain that. Perfect bone profiles. So greens such as kale, broccoli, bok choy are as good as milk in terms of their calcium absorbability. This comes from Environmental Nutrition, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So green things, anything that you see there on the screen, will give you a good calcium. And if you have legumes and grains in your diet, and you have these things as well, you don't have to worry about calcium. And we'll deal a lot more with this as we go on in the lecture. So legumes and grains are good sources. And anything that is dark green will give you good calcium. Oh, my wife says I must put this one in. This comes from her garden. Carbohydrates. All right, let's just sum up briefly. What did we say about protein? Not too much protein. Even when you're bodybuilding, don't take excessive amounts. Increase your protein level, yes, but don't take excessive amounts. When you take excessive amounts, you create an acid system, particularly if you take animal proteins like casein, for example. A lot of these nutri programs contain casein and whey protein and all those really bad guys. Wait till you come to my lecture, Utterly Amazing. I'll show you how good they really are. Okay, don't miss that lecture tomorrow. So we don't want to have too much protein. And which type of protein will give you a better profile? Plant protein, but you have to have certain combinations. You must not have a restrictive diet. You must have a good mix and variety. So that kind of explodes the protein myth. What about carbohydrates? Well, some people say when you have a lot of carbohydrates, you get fat. But you see, complex carbohydrates don't make you fat. And what is more, complex carbohydrates together with fiber don't give you a very high glycemic index, so that even people that have insulin problems and diabetes should not have a problem if they have the right kind of carbohydrate. By the way, 2 groups of mice, this is one of those classic experiments done of old. And the group on the left over here, you can see their tails are nice and tight. And if you could see properly, you could see that their coats are shiny. And they're being held by a hand over there, and they're pulling away, so they are very lively and happy and shiny. The group on the right over here looks a bit haggard. Their coats are in very poor shape. You can see the tail is lying limp. They are not moving anymore. They are on the point of death. Now, what is the difference between these groups? Actually, no difference. They received exactly the same diet, except for one thing. The group on the left lived twice as long almost as the group on the right, and it got as much food as it required. And the group on the right got as much food as it wanted. So these were constant eaters, and these were restricted to what they needed, and they lived almost twice as long. Tells us something. Refined food. Refined food is a devitalized food. It impedes the immune system. It exacerbates diabetes problems. It can lead to cancer. For example, if you feed rats carcinogens, scientists also mean they do things like that. They feed something a carcinogen, causes cancer. And then they feed them complex carbohydrates with all the fibers and things in it. They show lower incidence of breast cancer than rats fed carcinogens and simple sugars. So refined foods plus a carcinogen, and we have lots of carcinogens in our environment that we get in from time to time. A complex carbohydrate diet would really assist in that. And then a complex carbohydrate diet also helps you to resist the craving for food, and that could help you with obesity problems. But what does the world do? It refines just about anything. Isn't it incredible that no matter where you go in the world, this one's taken in Turkey, the breads that you can buy there are refined, 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 refined. Everybody wants white bread. You need 2 loaves to make a sandwich. And they just go squash. And then you sit with this stuff in your stomach and you crave more food, and I'll tell you why in a moment. You all know what grain is composed of. It has, the greatest component is the endosperm, which is the white flour. And then it has the bran layers on the outside, and then there's the germ layer on the inside. And in the good old days, you had stone mills, and that ground all this stuff together, and what came out was a total mix of everything. Isn't that right? Not these days. You have roller mills, which crack the wheat and crack off these layers on the outside, and then as they roll, the germ sticks together, and the bolting process shakes out the white flour, so you have 3 components at the end of the day. You have the bran, you have the white flour, and then you have the germ. And then you put that into 3 packages, and you get 3 times as much money as if you sold it as 1 packet. So it makes sense, economic sense. Then, of course, you get sick if you only eat this one, so they tell you, no, you have to eat the other as well, so you have to buy it, you see. And the other one that comes in the germ, which is rich in vitamin E, they put it in a bottle and they say, put it on your skin, forget about your stomach. So the ladies put it on their skins. You know what? If you had these components in your diet, you would have a lot less problems. Another problem is that these layers outside contain certain groups of vitamins that are required for the proper digestion of the groups in the middle. So, for example, the B5 group is largely here in the bran, but is required for the digestion and assimilation of the carbohydrate there in the middle. There are 2 types of fiber over there. You have soluble fiber, and you have insoluble fiber. Now, the insoluble fiber helps that everything goes down the intestine fairly easily. So if you had a diet which was rich in complex carbohydrate, complete with all its components, you could get rid of the newspapers in the little room. Not only that, whatever happened in the little room would not be such an eye-bulging experience. But there's another problem. When you have refined food of any kind, and you digest it over there, and you don't have the fiber that goes along with it, you run into all kinds of problems. Now, New Scientist just recently carried a summary. They summarized the sort of highlight literature of the world. They had an article on junk food, and which they quoted from the scientific literature, of course. You love it, but so do the bugs in your gut. And that could be bad news. If you thought junk food would merely make you fat, think again. You could also be fattening a hungry mass of alien gut bacteria that may repay you with bowel disease or even cancer. This is research done by the Dunn Nutrition Center in Cambridge University. The study showed that as meat consumption rises from 60 to 600 grams per day, and how much fiber is there in meat, by the way? None. Sulfates, we spoke about that before, didn't we? In the urine double, but sulfites in the feces increase tenfold. So a lot of that protein, we cannot even digest it properly. It goes through to the colon. The bacteria get hold of it, break it down, but they don't break it down to sulfate, they break it down to sulfite. What you break down, you get rid of as sulfate, that gets rid of your calcium, but the bacteria produce sulfites. So, normally, if you have a diet that is low in these proteins, then you will ferment, these bacteria will ferment the foods in the intestines, hydrogen metabolism plus carbon dioxide, and they have a group of bacteria called methanogens, and the end product is methane, which happens to be a gas, a flammable gas. But methane is totally harmless. In fact, that's what cows produce. They belch methane. And you can produce this methane in your intestine, and methane is relatively odorless as well. Noisy, but odorless. Whereas, if you have these proteins, the high animal proteins, you have a lot of these sulfates that are produced, and then you have this group of bacteria, sulfate-reducing bacteria, and they produce the sulfides. Now, that adds a certain aromatic experience to whatever was there before. And what is more, these bacteria over here, with all the sulfide and things, are actually ones that you don't want. You want more of these methanogens. So your diet will determine whether you have a happy flora or an unhappy flora, an aromatic flora or a noisy flora. Right. What is more, the insoluble fiber, as you can see, is very largely correlated to colon cancer. So if you have a lot of this fiber in your diet, you eat unrefined foods, then you will see that you have very low levels of colon cancer. And the less you have, the more unrefined or food you have, more refined food at least, the higher your level or your probability of getting this cancer. Plus, of course, all the problems associated with that squeezing experience, like diverticulosis, little bulges in the gut, which eventually can cause little traps, catch feces, become infected, and then you can have all kinds of intestinal problems, eventually polyps developing, which eventually can become carcinogenic. And you can have a lot of bad news, and eventually you can have cancer and inactive bowel. Now, if you look at the composition of some selected sweet foods, and you take the sugars that we eat daily, like cold drinks and jams and sugars and syrups and honeys and all these good things, and we look at fiber, then just look at that. There's no fiber in any of them. Even honey doesn't have fiber. All right, honey has more of some nutritious components than, let's say, sugar or something, but there is no fiber. So no wonder the Bible says, eat honey, my child, but not too much. Do you remember that? That's what it says. Now let me tell you about the other sugar, and this becomes, or the other fiber. So you had the insoluble fiber, which helps the food to go down quickly, But there's another fiber that's very, very important, and that's the soluble fiber. That's the one that makes things gummy. If you cook oatmeal, have you noticed that it goes thick and gooey? All right, that's as a consequence of the soluble fiber. If you have a date, do you notice that a date is very tacky? That's the soluble fiber that makes the date very tacky. Is a date very sweet? Yes, but it's packed. The sweetest thing has the highest level of soluble fiber. You know what? That smacks of design. That's so design-orientated, it's mind-boggling. So the more sweet there is in a particular fruit, the more soluble fiber there will be, either in the form of pectin or gums or guar gums or whatever. Now, here is a glucose meal. Now notice what happens. Let's say you have a glucose meal and there is no fiber in it. Then you find that the level of glucose in the blood jumps very high. Eventually, because of insulin secretion, down it comes. And here is insulin on this side. The high glucose causes a very great surge of insulin. And this high surge quickly reduces the amount of glucose in the blood. But because you have so much insulin, you're actually reducing it to lower than what you started off with. Can you see that? That's where you started off with. That was resting. And after a refined meal with no fiber in it, you actually end up with a lower blood glucose level than before. And we say you are hypoglycemic. You have a low blood sugar. Does that make sense? Okay. When you add fiber to the glucose meal, say the fiber from oats or something like that, you will see that the glucose level doesn't rise that high. It comes down, down, down slowly because the insulin level doesn't rise that high. And at the end of the process, you have roughly the same glucose level as you had before, and you are not hypoglycemic. Does that make sense to you? Now, hypoglycemia is the scourge of our day. I tell my students, when you come and write an exam for me, you will not have a refined foods before you come and write this exam. You will open the window that there is oxygen for your brain to function, and you will not drink a Coke before you come and write the exam. What will the average student tell me after that lecture? They will tell me I'm bonkers, right? Everybody drinks Coke and they feel better that way. And I say to them, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll do an experiment. Our practical will be on Coca-Cola. And that's exactly what we did then. So, I'm so mean. We take these rabbits and we put the rabbits on various drinks. They quite like whatever you give them. The first group gets glucose, water. The next group gets glucose plus fiber. The next group gets cola. Equivalent amounts of sugar worked out exactly to make it equivalent to a human being drinking 1 can of this particular drink. And then we put them through the process. Now, unfortunately, my prac could only last 3.5 hours, so I didn't finish it. But it gives us a nice indication. Here, the group that received the sugar water, up went the glucose levels, very high. That, by the way, is a significant difference. The stats are not on here. And up it went to that level, and then it started coming down. And eventually, we did an experiment later, which I haven't got the graph of. It does become hypoglycemic. Here, you had a slower rise, and you can see this difference there. That one had the gum added. It did rise almost as high, but it didn't go hypoglycemic. And the Coke, we missed the peak. It was so quick. The body reacted by going, squeezing in so much insulin that down it came. And after 1.5 hours, hypoglycemia set in. Now, in a 3-hour exam, that means that in the last hour of your exam, you will be totally hypoglycemic. And you might start off well, and suddenly you go blank. Oh, I went blank. I couldn't remember anything. That's what happens. And what is more, the student starts panicking and freaking and going crazy. Why? Because these are the symptoms of hypoglycemia. Sweating, even heavy sweating, shaking, warmness, pounding heart, increased heart rate, anxiety, and shivering. And the neuroglycopenic symptoms are confusion, drowsiness, weakness, difficulty in speaking, loss of concentration, visual disturbances, and even double vision and dizziness. Doesn't that just sound like someone panicking? And you know what? Half of the world's society is in that state. We have a constant population living in anxiety with heart shaking and you name it, confusion, heat, hot flushes. And I'm not talking about menopause either. So these symptoms are typical of our Western society. So the bottom line is, if you're going to have a healthy diet, then try to stay away as much as possible from refined foods. Does that make sense? Now you understand why. You give a child a breakfast that is non-refined, the glucose goes into his blood slowly, and he has a constant supply because the soluble fiber holds on to the sugar and doesn't allow it to go into the blood that quickly. That's why chewing gum, when you chew it, retains its flavor so long because the fiber holds on to the sweetness. And in the same way, it'll allow the glucose to go into the blood slowly. Now, I'm not saying never have refined food. You can get sick and tired of a healthy diet. Have you noticed that? And there will come a time when you say, I've had it with this healthy diet. Give me something within limits that is not so healthy, please. And that's fine. Then you have some refined pasta, or you have something that's, you have a donut or a whatever that's refined. And when you do it, enjoy it. Don't have a face this long and think that you are creating mortal sins. Your lifestyle should be a healthy lifestyle. But never ever should we be long-faced, miserable health fanatics and freaks. Right, fatty issues. UK figures for carbohydrate versus fat consumption. Because we have this notion that carbohydrates make you fat, people are eating less and less carbohydrate, and particularly since they're eating refined foods, you have to eat more and more and more because the fiber actually fills you up, right? So when you have white rice, white bread, and white this and white that, you can eat so much more, and that's what causes obesity in the end. But we also find that fat consumption in the world has really increased here since the 1940s. Up, 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 up. And since the 70s, in the Western countries, it has been about on a par. Fat is one of those issues that gives satiety. It's one of those issues that gives the slip down easy feeling. And fat is one of the components that dissolves aromatics, so it gives a lot of taste to food. So people crave fat in the diet. Free fat in the diet is a problem. You see, when you digest fat, free fat in the diet, you add your bile salts eventually, and it causes these little droplets, and then these little droplets enter into the cells. There they are converted to triglycerides, and they enter the lacteals. Now let me explain that in a simple way. I'm going to do this very simply. You have two ways in which you can transport what you digest and what you absorb. It can go into the lacteals, which is the lymphatic system, or it can go into the blood vessels. And there's a major difference as to which way it'll go. For example, if you have soluble fat in the diet, let's take avocado, or nut milks, or nut creams, or any one of those. Are those fats water soluble, yes or no? Yes, they're water soluble. If you isolate the fats, they are no longer water soluble. Are you with me? Okay, so you could take avocado and smear it on a plate and hold it under cold water and wash it off. If you extracted the avocado oil by beating and beating and beating and beating, and you put the oil on there, would it wash off under cold water, yes or no? No. Okay, so any free fat in the diet will be like oil in water, because you're putting it in your stomach and there's water in your stomach, right or wrong? Okay. If I put oil into warm water, and your stomach contains warm water, it's at 37 degrees centigrade, right? If I put oil into warm water, and I took a plate and I went dip and out, would I have a layer of oil on the plate, yes or no? Yes, you could go squeak and you'd have a layer of oil. My enzymes are water soluble. When I put free fat into my diet, it coats everything, just like that plate is coated. And the enzyme battles to get through. And then there is a hormone that picks that up and tells your stomach, you better keep shut for a little longer than normal, and so your cooking pot goes for a longer while. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, when that free fat goes through into the duodenum, it's already released free fat. The bile works on it, and immediately it gets absorbed in the first part of your intestine, and it ends up largely in the lymphatic system, largely. Which means that eventually it finds its way all the way up here into the subclavian and enters into your blood system as is. So now you have free fat floating around in your blood system. And you have little red blood corpuscles there, which are little plates that you are dipping in a fatty solution. So you are getting a tiny film of this oil on it, which impedes oxygen exchange. Have you noticed that after a fatty meal, you get so incredibly tired? Because you're cutting the oxygen supply to your brain. Whereas, if you had non-free fat, like in the seed, liquidized even, but still water soluble, like soy milks or nut milks or nut creams or avocados or any oil in its natural still form, it would be water soluble, it wouldn't cause that problem. When it gets into the duodenum and into the intestine, the outer layer must first be digested before the oil is released, and then only would the enzymes start working, and by the time you absorb it, it's lower down. Interestingly, then it goes into the portal system and goes via the liver, which takes care of the problem, and you don't have that high fat in your blood. So you wouldn't be so tired after your meal. You can remain alert. You know, in the old days when I had a really rotten diet, I used to come home lunchtimes and I'd go and lie on the carpet and say, oh, I don't know how I'm going to give this lecture, I'm so dull. Nowadays, it doesn't happen anymore. Actually, it's quite irritating. I also would like to relax after lunch. Right. Let's talk about body fat. How much should you have? Well, you can work it out very simply. Your body mass index is a good indicator. You just take your body weight in kilograms and you divide it by your height times your height. And then you can work out your body mass index. And you will find, this is fathers not working due to illness, this is a study in India, that when the body mass index drops much below 20, then people tend to get ill. So you don't want to be like a rake. You don't want to look like somebody who has, you know, real problems. On the other hand, if your body mass index starts rising above here around about 26, 27, 28, then it becomes an exponential, and this is a relative risk of diabetes is increased. So you want your body mass index to be never less than 18, preferably around about the 20s to about 25, 26. That's perfect. If you go a little bit higher, that's also still okay. But once you get to 35, then you are in a very high risk category for disease. And many, many people in the Western society are way, way above what they should be. And it is regarded as perfectly acceptable. Last point I want to just point out, you get various types of fat. And I want to talk about good fat versus bad fat. Saturated fats are very compact, and the molecule, again, is very dense, whereas unsaturated fats tend to be loose and tend to be easier to digest, but also easier to oxidize. So there are some problems here which I'll deal with in the next lecture. Cholesterols, we've already dealt with it. What is the major problem with cholesterol? The type of protein that you eat. And if you are a vegetarian, do you get cholesterol in your diet, yes or no? No, you don't get any cholesterol in your diet. None whatsoever. And you get plant proteins, so you shouldn't have a problem. If you have the right relationship of various types of amino acids by right relationships of proteins, that should not be problematic. You need, however, two types of amino acids which are unsaturated, not amino acid, fatty acids, linoleic acid and linolenic acid. And you can see that they are unsaturated. And you can find them in soy, you can find them in seeds, you can find them all over the place. The fat that causes the least problems in our health is the monounsaturated fats. Now, monounsaturated here is blue, and you can see the one that has the highest level of monounsaturated is olive oil. So olive oil, of all the oils, would be the best oil to use. As you go up to sunflower seed oils, once you use them in the extracted form, they have a problem. But if you use them in the non-extracted form, they're not so problematic. But I'll deal with that in the next lecture. So let's just have a look at things that have rich monounsaturated oil levels. You'll see nuts, almonds, hazelnuts, pistachios, sesame seeds, mono sunflower seed oil, which you don't always get or very seldom get, peanuts even, avocados, olive oil, and canola oil, although canola oil is rapeseed oil, and there are all kinds of little problems associated with that these days. But if you look at the general ones, olive oil, avocados, and the nut family, they are rich in mono oils. It's almost as if this is designed. So whole food is good food, and if you have lots of fruits and vegetables and legumes and grains in your diet, even partly refined like tofus and some products is not that bad, and you have unrefined grains and nuts and fruits and all these delicious things in your diet, then you will have an abundance of everything that you require. Don't do that. One last point. Sport. Everybody is crazy about energy for doing what you want to do. Here are two groups of athletes. Now, the one group of athletes was placed on a high carbohydrate diet, high complex carbohydrate diet, and the other group was placed on a low carbohydrate diet, which means it had a high protein diet. Now, in the past, if you were an athlete, you got a high protein diet. If you were a boxer, you got a big steak before the final event. These days, that's old-fashioned. We know that a high carbohydrate diet, that's a plant-based high carbohydrate diet, is the way to go. Let me show you what they found. Here they have training sessions. So in the morning, this is a 24-hour period, and the second 24 hours, and the third 24 hours. The athletes go on a training bout. So in the morning, they go for their training session. And as a consequence, their glycogen levels in their muscles drop. They're using the glycogen. Then during the day, they go on their diet, and the one group eats a high carbohydrate diet, and the glycogen levels recover to that level. The other group, on a low carbohydrate diet, the glycogen levels in the blood, in the muscles, only recover to that level. Second day, they go out on their training session, so down it comes. They recover to that level, whereas these recover to that level. Third day, down it comes. They recover to that level, but these recover to that level. can you see if we perpetuate this now for a week or 2 weeks, that this gap over here gets bigger and bigger? Can you see that? Now let's say the day before the bout, you actually don't take a training session. That means the athlete would start there and he would then recover to his normal level during that day of non-activity. Is that correct? Whereas the next one would only recover to that level, which is way down from the original level. That is why today, if you want to perform as an athlete, you have to become a vegetarian. Everybody knows that. Glycogen is essential for prolonged exercise. Exhaustion is due to lack of muscle glycogen. Power und Ausdauer. The great stars of the world, Steffi Graf, Boris Becker, all the great tennis players of the world, what do? They're switching to vegetarian diets. Mit pflanzlicher Stärke zu tierischer Kraft, with plant power to animal power. All the great Olympic athletes are switching to high carbohydrate diets and dropping the protein levels. So there is power in carbohydrates, in pastas, in fruits, in grains. And you have nothing to fear if you do it right. So now take a short break, and after this break, come back for the next exciting episode. Thank you.